This is true crime stories for sleep. The Texas sun pressed hard against the dirt roads of West Dallas, baking the earth until the dust rose and shimmered like heat waves. Wooden shacks leaned against each other for balance, their tin roofs buzzing beneath the weight of summer. The smell of oil, sweat, and laundry soap lingered in the air, mingling with the distant sound of trains that rolled through the edge of the city. This was the Dallas that raised Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, a city of survival and stubborn hope, where people dreamed big but lived small. Before we begin their story, take a moment to subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. It's your support that keeps these forgotten tales of history alive, one story at a time. Clyde Chestnut Barrow came first, born in 1909 in a poor farming family in Ellis County, Texas. His father, Henry Barrow, rented land that refused to yield, and his mother, Cummy, carried the burden of feeding 7 children on hope alone. When the crops failed, the Barrows loaded their few belongings onto a wagon and headed north toward Dallas. They built a tent home out of scrap wood and canvas in a place called the Cement City, a patch of rough ground on the city's outskirts where the poor gathered like driftwood. Clyde was the 5th child, quick with a grin, small for his age, restless in his bones. He liked music, could play the guitar better than most boys on the block, and he had a streak of charm that made people forgive him when he went too far. He watched trains slide past the horizon and dreamed of what lay beyond them. The Great Depression hadn't arrived yet, but life for the Barrows was already a lesson in going without. A few miles away, another family lived in similar struggle. Emma and Charles Parker raised their children in a small house near the industrial edge of West Dallas. Their daughter, Bonnie Elizabeth Parker, was born in 1910, small, red-haired, and sharp as a tack. She had a voice that carried when she laughed, and a streak of independence uncommon for a girl of her time. Teachers remembered her as bright, quick-witted, and fond of poetry. She carried a notebook everywhere, scribbling verses about love, freedom, and faraway places she longed to see. Bonnie's father died when she was 4, leaving her mother to support the family by cooking for boarders. Money was scarce, but Bonnie never stopped believing she was meant for something more. She read dime novels, idolized movie stars, and loved the thrill of stories where outlaws turned their struggles into legend. She wasn't a criminal, not then, just a dreamer in a neighborhood that taught her how quickly dreams could be stolen. By the time Clyde turned 16, he was restless. Honest work didn't hold his attention. Hauling fence posts, washing dishes, shining shoes, nothing seemed to matter enough to keep him still. He fell in with older boys who taught him how to steal chickens, then cars, and how to disappear before sunrise. Most of what he took wasn't worth much, but for Clyde, it was never about the money. It was about motion, the rush of doing something the world said he couldn't. West Dallas during the 1920s was a patchwork of ambition and desperation. The city glittered across the river with jazz, lights, and fine cars, but for those living beyond the Trinity, that glitter was just another reminder of what they didn't have. Bootleggers moved quietly through the night, carrying whiskey in barrels and promises in whispers. Police patrols came through now and then, but few things changed. Poverty stayed, and so did the people who learned to bend around it. Bonnie, meanwhile, was trying to carve her own small space in the world. She excelled in school, acted in plays, and won praise for her essays. Yet beneath her polite manners was a restless spark. She married young, a boy named Roy Thornton, a classmate with a wild streak. The marriage was impulsive and short-lived. Roy drifted toward trouble, and before long he was gone, leaving Bonnie with a wedding ring and a heart that refused to sit still. She took work as a waitress, smiling for tips, writing poems on napkins during slow afternoons, wondering if life would ever become what she'd imagined. Clyde, at the same time, was moving deeper into the shadow of crime. He and his brother Buck were stealing cars by night and working odd jobs by day. They weren't killers, not yet, just small-time thieves chasing quick cash in a world that offered them none. But Dallas law enforcement was tightening its grip, and Clyde's reputation as a troublemaker began to follow him. He was arrested more than once, for possession of stolen goods, for joyriding, but always managed to talk his way out, or escape with minor punishment. The late 1920s brought change. The stock market crashed, and what little work there had been dried up completely. Breadlines formed downtown, and families in West Dallas shared what they could: a bag of beans, a loaf of bread, a little hope. Desperation blurred the line between right and wrong. Stealing wasn't rebellion anymore, it was survival. And in the midst of that struggle, the paths of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were about to cross. In January 1930, Clyde visited a friend's house in West Dallas, a small place with creaking floorboards and a radio humming in the corner. Bonnie was there, helping the friend recover from an injury. When Clyde walked through the door, the air shifted. He was 20, slim, with slicked back hair and a smile that could light a cigarette from across the room. Bonnie was 19, curious, clever, with eyes that missed nothing. Neither could have known that the moment would change the course of both their lives. They talked like they'd known each other forever, about music, cars, and the world beyond Texas. Bonnie lent him a smile. Clyde offered a story. By nightfall, she was smitten. There was something magnetic about him: the confidence, the laughter, the danger hiding under the charm. To her, Clyde wasn't another boy from West Dallas. He was a doorway to the life she'd always written about. To him, Bonnie was different from anyone he'd ever met. She believed in him, even when he had nothing to give. For a few weeks, they lived inside that fragile dream. Bonnie wrote poems for him, Clyde played his guitar, and the two spent hours driving through the backroads, talking about everything they'd do once they escaped the grind of the city. But Dallas was never kind to dreamers. In March of 1930, police arrested Clyde for a string of car thefts and sent him to jail in Waco. Bonnie visited him, slipping him cigarettes and whispering that she'd wait. She kept her promise, even when waiting became the hardest thing she'd ever done. Inside the jail's gray walls, Clyde learned quickly that charm meant nothing. Guards were harsh, food scarce, and beatings common. He saw men broken down to shadows of themselves. By the time he was transferred to Eastham Prison Farm, a place infamous for its brutality, something inside him began to change. The boy who once smiled at the sound of music was learning a different kind of rhythm: survival. Back in West Dallas, Bonnie wrote letters, poems, and dreams on paper she couldn't send. Her mother told her to forget him, to find a decent job, to leave the trouble behind. But Bonnie was already lost in the idea of Clyde Barrow, not just a man, but what he represented: freedom, defiance, the chance to live beyond the fences that held everyone else in place. The wind over Dallas carried the sound of trains and promise, but both came and went without warning. The decade was closing, and the country was slipping deeper into despair. Two young Texans, one hardened by prison, the other driven by restless longing, were heading toward a story that would burn across America. Neither knew what waited on the other side of those dusty roads, only that the world they were leaving had offered them nothing. And somewhere between the hunger of the Barrow shack and the poetry of Bonnie's notebook, history took its first breath of their legend. Two lives born from dust, about to collide with destiny. The air inside Eastham Prison Farm was heavy, a mix of sweat, dirt, and fear. Rows of inmates moved in rhythm beneath the punishing Texas sun, their chains clinking like a grim symphony of obedience. Guards on horseback watched from the edges of the field, rifles slung casually across their shoulders. They didn't shout, they didn't have to. The threat of the whip was enough. Eastham was where men went to disappear, and in 1930, Clyde Barrow was just another number among them. The boy who had once stolen cars for fun now faced a world that recognized no mercy. Eastham was known as Hell on Earth, a place where cruelty was routine and survival was the only goal. Clyde had arrived with the same cocky grin he'd worn in West Dallas, but that vanished within days. Prisoners worked from dawn until dusk, chopping trees, hauling lumber, and digging ditches under the blazing heat. Water was rationed. Food was scarce. Beatings were constant. At first, Clyde tried to keep his head down. He was small, barely over 5'6", and he knew better than to challenge the men who ruled the cell blocks, both guards and inmates alike. But prison had its own order, its own kind of economy, and Clyde quickly learned that weakness was a currency no one could afford. He saw men robbed, beaten, and broken before his eyes. Some prayed. Others stopped talking altogether. The rest learned to adapt. One inmate, Ed Crowder, took a particular interest in him, the kind of interest that carried the weight of menace. Crowder was older, stronger, and known for preying on younger men. For weeks, Clyde tried to avoid him, working longer hours, sleeping with his back to the wall. But in a place like Eastham, avoidance was temporary. One night, after lights out, the sound of struggle echoed down the corridor. When morning came, Ed Crowder was dead, bludgeoned with a steel pipe. No one saw a thing, and no one talked. But among the prisoners, everyone knew who had done it. Clyde Barrow was no longer a boy. The act changed him. Whatever innocence remained from his West Dallas days was gone. The charm, the easy grin, the laughter that used to bubble up when he played his guitar, all of it had been replaced by a cold stillness. To survive Eastham, you had to become harder than the men who ran it. And Clyde did. There was one prisoner who saw something different in him, an older man named Ralph Fultz. Fultz had been in and out of prison for years, and he recognized in Clyde the mix of brains and boldness that made a good partner. Over long nights in their cell, they talked about what came next, not survival, but freedom. Not the kind of freedom that came from parole or good behavior, but the kind that came from breaking the system wide open. Together, they began to plan. Fultz knew people on the outside who could get weapons, maps, and cars. Clyde knew the roads, the small banks, the back roads where the law was thin. They whispered about escape as if it were a prayer. And as days turned into months, Clyde's hatred for Eastham hardened into something sharper: revenge. Meanwhile, Bonnie Parker was waiting. She promised him she would, and she kept her word. Every few weeks, she visited the prison with her hair pinned back, a shy smile hiding her worry. The guards laughed about the pretty little thing who loves the convict. But Bonnie didn't care. She brought him cigarettes, notes, and sometimes food tucked inside folded napkins. She believed in him, believed he'd get out and start fresh. But each time she left, Clyde was reminded of the world he'd lost, the world that smelled like coffee and dust instead of sweat and fear. By 1931, his patience was gone. He'd had enough of chains, enough of rules, enough of the cruelty that broke men until they were nothing more than ghosts in stripes. He made his move. One morning, as the guards marched the work crew out to the fields, Clyde pretended to stumble, grabbing his leg as though injured. When the guard bent down to check, another inmate, one of Fultz's men, distracted him just long enough for Clyde to slip away toward the trees. He ran barefoot across rough ground, heart hammering, breath burning in his chest. Shots rang out behind him, but he didn't stop. He didn't make it far. By nightfall, bloodhounds had tracked him to a nearby creek. Exhausted, he surrendered. His escape attempt earned him a savage beating and several more years on his sentence. For most men, that would have been the end of hope. But for Clyde, it was just another lesson. Freedom wouldn't come from running, it would come from removing what trapped him. In January 1932, desperate to get out of Eastham by any means necessary, Clyde asked a fellow inmate to help him maim himself. They stole an axe from the work shed, and Clyde placed his left big toe on a block of wood. One swing, and the toe was gone. The pain was blinding, the blood pooling fast, but it worked. Declared medically unfit for field labor, he was transferred to an easier job and, not long after, considered for early parole. Ironically, just weeks before his parole was approved, Governor Ross Sterling signed the papers releasing him. The self-inflicted wound that cost him 2 toes came too late, but it didn't matter. Clyde Barrow walked out of Eastham in February 1932 a free man. Physically, he was thinner, scarred, and limping. Mentally, he was unrecognizable. The first place he went was Dallas. Bonnie was waiting for him, just as she'd promised. When he knocked on her door, she opened it and froze, seeing the shadow of the man she once knew. His eyes were harder, his movements slower, more deliberate. But when he smiled, even faintly, it was enough. She threw her arms around him, and the two of them stood there for a long time, silent except for the hum of the city outside. Clyde told her about Eastham, not in detail, but enough for her to understand. Enough for her to see the kind of man prison had made him. He didn't want to be a victim anymore. He wanted control. And the only way he saw to get it was through the barrel of a gun. Bonnie didn't flinch. She'd spent too many nights imagining this moment to turn back now. Whatever Clyde decided to do, she was with him. She always had been. At first, Clyde tried honest work. He took a job at a glass company, running errands and stacking boxes. But after years behind bars, routine felt unbearable. His limp made labor difficult, and his prison record closed doors faster than he could knock. Within weeks, he was back behind the wheel of a stolen car, meeting up with old friends, Raymond Hamilton, W.D. Jones, and Ralph Fultz. Together, they planned small robberies, grocery stores, gas stations, local shops. Nothing big yet, nothing flashy. Just fast, simple scores to build a stake. Each time they drove out on a job, Bonnie came along. She wasn't armed yet, just curious, watching, learning, writing in her notebook. Her love for Clyde was fierce, almost reckless. She wrote poems about the road, about the thrill of movement, about standing beside the man she believed the world had wronged. In one of her notebooks, she scribbled a line that would later echo through history. "Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side." By the spring of 1932, Clyde was already dreaming bigger. The petty jobs weren't enough. The real money, he knew, was in banks, small-town branches with just one guard and a few tellers. He began to gather weapons, cars, and men who could be trusted. He wasn't planning a spree. He was building a crew. But there was another motive simmering beneath it all, Eastham. The prison that had taken his youth still haunted him. Clyde didn't just want to escape it anymore. He wanted to hit it back. He wanted to free the men who'd suffered beside him and burn down the system that had crushed them. Every night, as he and Bonnie drove through the back roads of Texas, the headlights cutting through the dark, they talked about that dream, about the day they'd storm Eastham and never look back. The car engine roared like a promise, and the stars stretched endlessly above them. Clyde Barrow had come out of prison with a limp and a scar, but inside, something far more dangerous had been forged: resolve. And as Bonnie watched him behind the wheel, his eyes fixed on the open road, she realized that the man she loved wasn't coming home to stay. He was going back out there, into the dust, the danger, and the legend waiting to be written. The summer of 1932 settled hot and restless over Texas. Dust storms rolled across the plains, turning the sky the color of brass. The Great Depression had sunk its teeth into every town. Men lined up for bread, farms lay silent, and the air felt heavy with defeat. Across those quiet highways, a black Ford V8 moved fast and low, its engine growling like a caged animal. Inside sat a man with a pistol on his belt and a woman with a notebook on her lap. Clyde Barrow was back on the road, and Bonnie Parker was now riding shotgun. They had started small, little jobs, quick hits, nothing grand enough to make the papers. Clyde was testing his luck again, learning which stores had weak alarms, which towns had lazy sheriffs, and which roads could get him out fast. He worked with old friends like Raymond Hamilton and Ralph Fultz, both of whom had served time and knew how to keep quiet. But Bonnie wasn't supposed to be part of it. At least, that's what Clyde told her. She didn't listen. Bonnie's love for Clyde was more than affection, it was belief. She saw him as someone who'd been cornered by a system built for the rich and cruel to the poor. To her, the robberies weren't crimes, they were rebellion. She wanted to be close to him, to share the danger, to see the world beyond waitressing shifts and rented rooms. So she climbed into his car one night and refused to get out. Their first real run together didn't go as planned. Clyde had targeted a small hardware store outside Kaufman, Texas. It was supposed to be quick: smash the safe, grab the cash, drive off. But as the sound of glass shattered through the night, the owner's son woke and grabbed a shotgun. One blast tore through the dark, hitting Bonnie in the leg. The car screeched away into the night, Clyde swearing as blood soaked the seat beside him. They barely made it back to Dallas. Bonnie spent weeks recovering in a cramped apartment, while Clyde and his crew laid low. She didn't complain. She wrote poems and short stories instead, tales of lovers on the run, of loyalty tested by fire. Her leg never healed quite right, leaving her with a limp that would stay for the rest of her life. But when she could walk again, she was back in the Ford, leaning out the window, her hair whipping in the wind. By late 1932, Clyde had begun forming what would later be known as the Barrow Gang. The group shifted often, a rotating cast of ex-cons, drifters, and desperate kids who followed Clyde because he knew how to move fast and think faster. W.D. Jones, just 16 years old, became his shadow. He was reckless, jumpy, eager to impress. Buck Barrow, Clyde's older brother, drifted in and out, sometimes bringing his wife, Blanche. Together, they were a strange kind of family, bound not by blood, but by the rhythm of running. Clyde's skill behind the wheel was unmatched. He could spin a car at 50 miles an hour, thread it through narrow backroads, and vanish before lawmen could react. The new Ford the 5.8 was his weapon of choice, light, fast, and powerful. Henry Ford himself had once received a letter, supposedly from Clyde, praising the machine for its speed. Whether Clyde actually wrote it or not, it captured his legend perfectly. Most of their targets were small, gas stations, grocery stores, rural banks that kept more dust than dollars in their safes. The profits were thin, but the thrill was rich. Bonnie and Clyde weren't building a fortune. They were building a name, and word of that name began to spread. In April 1932, they hit a store in Hillsboro, Texas. The owner, J.N. Booker, resisted. A shot was fired. Booker fell dead. The newspapers lit up the next morning. Texas bandits kill merchant. Woman accomplice escapes with gang. The story of Bonnie and Clyde had begun to write itself, one bullet at a time. Law enforcement called them killers. Locals called them folk heroes. The truth lay somewhere between, two young people caught in the wild space between desperation and defiance. Photos began to surface, snapshots taken with stolen cameras, showing Bonnie with a pistol on her hip, posing beside Clyde like a starlet in a crime picture. One famous shot showed her with a cigar clenched between her teeth, grinning playfully. The press ran it everywhere, calling her cigar-smoking gun moll Bonnie Parker. She didn't even smoke cigars. It had been a joke, a bit of fun in front of the lens. But the image stuck. By the end of 1932, the Barrow Gang was wanted in multiple states. Police roadblocks dotted Texas highways, and sheriffs began to coordinate across county lines. But the gang stayed ahead, always moving, always a day faster than the law. They switched cars often, slept in fields, abandoned farmhouses, and cheap motels. When they needed food, they'd trade stolen goods or pay cash from their robberies. When they needed to hide, they found sympathetic locals who'd grown tired of the Depression's cruelty and saw Bonnie and Clyde as a middle finger to authority. Still, the road wasn't glamorous. Bonnie's limp worsened, her foot sometimes too swollen to walk. The men argued constantly, over money, over plans, over who was in charge. Clyde was quick-tempered but disciplined, ruling the gang more like a soldier than a leader. Every detail mattered: how long they stayed, where they parked, which direction they'd run if things went wrong. And things went wrong often. On Christmas Eve, 1932, Clyde and W.D. Jones attempted to steal a car in Temple, Texas. The owner resisted. Shots were fired. The man fell dead in the snow, his blood turning the white ground dark. It was another murder pinned to the Barrow Gang, whether Clyde had pulled the trigger or not. The papers were calling them a menace now, not just thieves, but killers. For a while, Bonnie and Clyde disappeared. They crossed state lines, into Oklahoma, then Missouri, then back into Texas. Each stop was a blur of hiding, running, stealing, loving. Nights were spent in the car, Bonnie's head resting against Clyde's shoulder, the engine idling quietly beneath them. Sometimes she'd hum songs from the radio. Sometimes they'd drive in silence, headlights carving through fog and night. In early 1933, Clyde's brother Buck was released from prison, and he and Blanche joined the gang. Buck was older, calmer, hoping to convince Clyde to settle down. He wanted to bring his brother home, to steer him away from the inevitable end that seemed to shadow their every move. For a while, it almost worked. They rented a small apartment over a garage in Joplin, Missouri, pretending to be a group of friends on vacation. Bonnie cooked breakfast on a hot plate, Blanche cleaned, and for the first time in months, they laughed without looking over their shoulders. But the illusion couldn't last. Neighbors grew suspicious. Too many cars, too many guns, too little sleep. The Joplin police decided to investigate. On April 13, 1933, officers approached the apartment quietly, hoping to question the residents. They didn't make it to the door. Clyde opened fire through the window. The small building erupted in chaos. Gunfire, shouting, smoke. Bonnie grabbed the car keys, WD grabbed the cash, and Buck fired back as they ran. 2 officers lay dead by the time the Ford roared out of the alley, tires screaming. Inside the apartment, police later found a camera and a roll of undeveloped film. When the pictures hit newspapers nationwide, the legend exploded. There was Bonnie, smiling with a pistol on her hip. There was Clyde, confident, cocky, dangerous. America was enthralled. In the middle of an age of poverty and despair, they had become symbols of rebellion, the outlaws who lived free when no one else could. But behind those photographs was a very different truth. The gang was exhausted, wounded, and running out of places to hide. Bonnie's legs still ached, Buck was shaken, and every road seemed to lead closer to the noose. The thrill that had once carried them was fading, replaced by tension and fatigue. Still, when Clyde looked at Bonnie, he saw more than trouble. He saw the girl who'd waited for him when the world turned its back. And when Bonnie looked at Clyde, she saw the man who'd promised her a life larger than the one she'd been given. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As they crossed back into Texas that spring, the roads stretched endlessly before them, a line of dust and promise cutting through the horizon. The legend of Bonnie and Clyde had already begun to burn. But for the 2 souls inside that black Ford, it wasn't legend yet. It was just the road, the sound of the wind, and the heartbeat of freedom, loud, reckless, and alive. The early months of 1933 found Bonnie and Clyde living on borrowed time. They'd escaped every trap, crossed every border, and turned every quiet town they touched into a headline. But now, the air was changing. The police weren't chasing shadows anymore, they were chasing names. Every lawman in Texas and beyond knew those names by heart, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. The pair had been on the run for more than a year when Clyde's brother, Buck, and his wife, Blanche, rejoined them. The Barrow Gang, as the papers now called them, needed a place to rest. They'd been sleeping in fields, abandoned barns, and cars for months. The group was worn thin, their nerves raw. They needed walls, a roof, and a few days of peace. So in April 1933, they found it, a modest 2-bedroom apartment over a garage in Joplin, Missouri. The apartment sat at 3347 34th Street, quiet and tucked behind a residential neighborhood. The garage below smelled of oil and gasoline, a scent that clung to everything Clyde touched. From the windows, you could see the rolling streets of Joplin, calm and unaware of the chaos that had just moved in upstairs. To anyone passing by, the Barrows looked like ordinary tenants, just young people with fast cars and laughter spilling through the open windows. For a brief moment, it almost felt normal. Bonnie took to cooking breakfast on a small stove, the aroma of coffee filling the apartment. Blanche cleaned, trying to keep the place looking respectable. Buck played cards with W.D. Jones, while Clyde tinkered with his Ford in the garage, polishing chrome and checking spark plugs with near-religious devotion. They had stolen the car a few weeks earlier, but to Clyde, it was more than a machine, it was freedom on 4 wheels. At night, when the city went quiet, Bonnie and Clyde would sit by the window, watching headlights glide down the distant road. Bonnie wrote poems again, small fragments about the road, about fate, about love. She titled one simply, Suicide Sal. The verses were dark, romantic, and strangely prophetic. But as peaceful as the days seemed, tension pulsed beneath the surface. Clyde could feel the net tightening. He'd spent years slipping past county lines and roadblocks, but the law was adapting. Communication between police departments was improving, and reports of their crimes traveled faster than ever before. Every robbery, every shooting, every stolen car built the myth higher, and made the hunt more personal. The Joplin hideout wasn't meant to last. They drew attention without trying. Neighbors noticed how little they came and went. The blinds were always drawn. Strange cars arrived at odd hours. And there were the sounds: gunshots from inside the garage, laughter that turned into shouting, and the faint smell of whiskey even though prohibition still ruled. On April 13, 1933, a neighbor finally made the call. He told the Joplin police that bootleggers might be operating out of the apartment over the garage. The report reached the desk of Detective Harry McGinnis. He didn't know it yet, but the people upstairs weren't bootleggers. They were the most wanted fugitives in the country. That afternoon, 5 officers arrived at the scene: Detectives McGinnis and Bert Wisnett, along with Patrolman Harriman, Grammond, and Doyle Johnson. They expected a simple arrest, maybe a scuffle. They pulled up quietly, parking near the curb. The sound of the car engine made Clyde glance up from the window. In that instant, everything changed. Clyde saw the reflection of badges in the sunlight and didn't hesitate. "They found us," he shouted. Within seconds, the apartment exploded into chaos. Bonnie grabbed the money bag, Buck snatched his shotgun, and Blanche screamed for everyone to get down. Clyde grabbed his Browning automatic rifle, a weapon stolen from a National Guard armory, and fired through the window. The first burst of gunfire shattered the calm of Joplin's quiet streets. Windows blew out, wood splintered, and the echo of automatic fire bounced off the garage walls. The police had no idea what they were walking into. They dove for cover, returning fire, but their pistols and shotguns couldn't match the roar of Clyde's machine gun. Detective McGinnis was struck in the head and killed instantly. Patrolman Harriman took a fatal shot to the chest. The surviving officers scrambled behind their car, glass raining down as bullets tore through metal. Inside the apartment, Bonnie helped reload, shouting over the deafening noise. W.D. Jones was hit in the arm but kept firing. Blanche screamed for them to stop, but it was too late. The gunfight had turned into a massacre. When the last bullet clicked empty, Clyde made the call to run. He grabbed Bonnie by the arm, shouting for everyone to get in the car. They barreled down the stairs, the smell of gunpowder and smoke thick in the air. Clyde's hands were slick with sweat as he turned the key. The Ford's engine roared to life, and the car shot out of the garage, fishtailing through the alley as more shots cracked behind them. They sped out of Joplin, leaving behind a trail of shattered glass, blood, and the echo of gunfire that would haunt the town for decades. When the police entered the apartment hours later, what they found would turn Bonnie and Clyde from criminals into living legends. On the kitchen table sat half-eaten food, an open map of Texas, and a few spent shells. A camera lay on the couch beside a stack of undeveloped film. The detectives collected it as evidence, not knowing what it contained. When the pictures were developed, the world saw Bonnie and Clyde as they had never been seen before. There she was, Bonnie Parker, dressed in a skirt and beret, a pistol on her hip, striking a pose beside Clyde's car. In another photo, she playfully pointed a rifle at Clyde, who smiled and raised his hands in mock surrender. But the most famous shot was the one that would define her forever, Bonnie with a cigar clamped between her teeth, laughing into the camera. The newspapers went wild. The Joplin Globe ran the photos first, followed by national papers from New York to Los Angeles. The pictures didn't just show criminals, they showed style. They showed youth, rebellion, love, and defiance. America had never seen anything like it. In the midst of Depression-era misery, Bonnie and Clyde became folk icons overnight. But while the photos made them famous, they also made them targets. Every sheriff, ranger, and federal agent in the South now had their faces pinned to their walls. The Joplin shootout had changed the stakes. Clyde wasn't a thief anymore. He was a cop killer. The gang fled south, driving through Oklahoma and Arkansas, avoiding main roads, hiding in wooded areas and roadside cabins. They slept little, ate less, and trusted no one. Bonnie kept her pistol close at all times, though she was still more writer than gunfighter. Her poems filled the quiet nights, her words often softening the edges of the life they'd chosen. Clyde, however, was changing. The months after Joplin hardened him. He stopped smiling as often. He began to speak less. His driving became more erratic, his temper sharper. He'd seen too many friends die, too many bodies left behind. The thrill of the chase had been replaced by the certainty of death. But even then, he refused to slow down. Bonnie understood that darkness in him. She carried her own version of it. She didn't fear the end. Somewhere deep inside, she knew how their story would close. But as long as the road stretched ahead, she would ride beside him. The newspapers kept feeding the legend. Clyde Barrow and his gun Moll, Bonnie Parker, still at large. One headline read. Modern-day Romeo and Juliet, said another. The press turned their blood-stained trail into romance, their violence into poetry. People pinned their photos to their walls, some out of admiration, others out of fear. Children collected newspaper clippings like trading cards. The Barrow gang's fame was now larger than their crimes. Everywhere they went, they were ghosts and stars all at once, too real to ignore, too unreal to fully believe. By the end of 1933, they were exhausted, infamous, and unstoppable. Their hideouts grew more desperate. Their circle grew smaller. And the lawmen chasing them were no longer local deputies with pistols. They were professionals, determined to end the myth once and for all. But for now, in that summer heat, as Bonnie leaned her head on Clyde's shoulder, and the Ford the 5th thundered down another back road, the legend was alive. The sound of the engine drowned out everything else, the sirens, the headlines, the graves they left behind. For them, the world was nothing but the road ahead, the wind through the windows, and the promise that as long as they kept moving, they could never be caught. The Barrow gang never stayed in one place for long. The open road had become both a sanctuary and a prison, winding endlessly through the dusty highways of Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Arkansas. Each town they passed whispered their names in fearful reverence. Bonnie Parker, the girl with a pistol and poetry, and Clyde Barrow, the man who could outrun every lawman in the state. Headlines screamed of their deeds, yet, for all their notoriety, the gang never lingered to enjoy the attention. Fame was dangerous, and danger had become their constant companion. After the violent shootout in Joplin, Missouri, the gang's path took them south toward Texas. The sun-baked roads of the Lone Star State stretched before them, alternating between highways flanked by endless fields and winding backroads lined with oaks and mesquite. Every mile carried tension. Bonnie kept her head on the passenger window, her notebook in her lap, scribbling poems about love, fear, and freedom while the Ford the 5th growled beneath them. The words were dark, romantic, prophetic, a strange counterpoint to the chaos surrounding them. Clyde's driving had become an art form. He could maneuver the car through narrow alleys, spin out of dead-end streets, and vanish into a patch of woods before the sound of pursuit could reach the ears of those chasing him. Yet, with each escape, the law adapted. Sheriffs began coordinating across counties. Police departments shared descriptions and bulletins. Federal agents grew involved, armed with better weapons and information networks that tracked the gang's every move. The chase was no longer just a local concern, it was national. By late 1933, the Barrow gang had begun targeting small-town banks. The strategy was simple: strike where security was lax, take what cash they could carry, and disappear before anyone could react. Each robbery added to their legend, but also to their body count. Innocent bystanders and lawmen alike fell in the crossfire. Each shooting hardened Clyde further, carving away the remnants of the boy who had stolen chickens for fun in West Dallas. One October morning, the gang rolled into a rural Oklahoma town. The bank there had a single teller and little cash on hand, but the robbery escalated into violence when the bank manager resisted. Shots rang out, echoing through the empty streets. 2 local men were killed in the confusion. The gang sped away in their Ford, leaving behind the smell of gunpowder and fear. In the car, Bonnie held a towel over her mouth to hide her cough, a habit she'd picked up from the smoke that always seemed to cling to Clyde and his guns. Despite the violence, Bonnie remained a figure of fascination. Her presence at the wheel, her sharp eyes and steady hands, contrasted sharply with the era's expectations of women. She carried herself with confidence, whether wielding a pistol or scribbling poetry in the back seat. The newspapers dubbed her a cigar-smoking gun moll, though she rarely smoked cigars. Photographs from Joplin and other hideouts solidified her image, a young woman who could laugh at danger and hold a gun like a badge of freedom. Clyde, meanwhile, was evolving. Every narrow escape reinforced his cunning and ruthlessness. He experimented with weapons, modifying them for speed and efficiency. The Browning automatic rifle had become his signature, capable of unleashing devastating firepower against anyone foolish enough to challenge him. The car was an extension of his body, the gun an extension of his will. Survival depended on precision, and Clyde had learned it through years of prison, theft, and bloodshed. The winter of 1933 brought snow and frost to parts of the Midwest. The gang avoided the main roads, traveling by night to evade patrols. When they stopped, it was always for short bursts, a small cabin, a farmer's barn, or the home of a sympathetic neighbor. They avoided towns where they were known, and when they did enter a community, they moved like shadows. The winters were brutal, yet the cold offered a kind of invisibility. Even the lawmen were reluctant to chase through frozen backroads, giving the gang temporary reprieve. During one of these cold nights, Bonnie wrote another poem. The lines were stark, her words reflecting the mix of fear, excitement, and love that defined her life with Clyde. We ride where no one follows. We love where no one stays. The wind is ours, the night is ours, until the world finds its way. Their fame, however, was spreading faster than the winter frost. Newspapers printed accounts of their exploits across multiple states, often exaggerating for effect. Stories of shootouts, car chases, and daring escapes captivated a nation hungry for escapism during the Depression. Some saw them as villains, others as modern-day Robin Hoods. The truth was more complicated. They were desperate, dangerous, and deeply in love. By early 1934, the gang's circle had narrowed. Buck Barrow and his wife, Blanche, remained with them, though Buck often expressed concern about Clyde's increasing aggression. W.D. Jones, still a teenager, followed out of loyalty and thrill, often clumsily handling weapons but eager to prove himself. Together, they had become a tight-knit unit, bound not just by crime, but by survival and a shared defiance of authority. One of the most notorious robberies during this period occurred in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. The gang struck a small bank, taking cash and valuables while leaving the teller and customers unharmed. But the escape did not go smoothly. A local deputy tried to intercept them, and a firefight erupted on a rural road. Bonnie and Clyde fired from the car as Buck returned fire from the back seat. Bullets ricocheted off trees and mailboxes, leaving splintered wood and torn signs in their wake. The gang escaped, but the encounter left them shaken. Despite the violence, moments of intimacy persisted. In the quiet after robberies, Bonnie and Clyde would sit together in the car, sharing cigarettes and whispered words. She would trace her fingers over his scars, remnants of Eastham prison, and he would watch her, admiring the way she moved, the way she endured. Their love was forged in chaos, a mix of tenderness and ferocity that only the road could create. In March 1934, the gang made headlines again in Black Lake, Texas. They robbed a small grocery store, stealing cash and some provisions. A local officer confronted them, but Clyde's driving and gun skills allowed the group to escape once more. Each robbery, each near-death encounter, added layers to the mythos surrounding them. Photographs, letters, and newspaper stories painted a picture of a couple and a gang untouchable, yet constantly pursued. Their notoriety began to attract attention beyond law enforcement. Thrill seekers and journalists began following leads, hoping for a glimpse of the fugitives. Some townspeople reported sightings, others spread rumors of their whereabouts, but the Barrows remained elusive. Their mobility was unmatched. No single county could hold them long enough to mount an effective arrest. The relentless pace, however, took a toll. Bonnie's limp worsened from old wounds. Buck's patience frayed under the strain of constant running. Blanche grew increasingly anxious. while W.D. Jones oscillated between fear and exhilaration. The tension was always present, a quiet hum beneath the roar of engines and gunfire. Every stop, every robbery, every encounter with the law edged them closer to an inevitable confrontation. And yet they pressed on. By mid-1934, the Barrow gang had left a trail of destruction and fascination stretching across Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Missouri. Their names appeared on wanted posters and in newspapers nationwide. Children clipped out the photos, adults whispered their stories, and lawmen doubled their efforts to capture them. But for Bonnie and Clyde, each day on the road reaffirmed their freedom, their love, and their bond. The car became a symbol as much as a weapon, a Ford the 5.8 that had outrun bullets, bullets that had shattered windows and echoed in towns for miles. The gun was an extension of Clyde, the notebook an extension of Bonnie. Together, they were unstoppable. As summer approached, the gang prepared for another series of robberies, each more daring than the last. They planned routes through unfamiliar towns, studied law enforcement patterns, and stockpiled weapons. Every day was a careful balance of risk and reward, survival and thrill. For Bonnie and Clyde, life was measured not in years, but in miles driven, bullets fired, and roads traveled. And yet, behind the legend, behind the thrill, the truth remained: they were human, vulnerable, and ever closer to the moment when luck would run out. For now, though, the wind carried their laughter, the night held their secrets, and the road stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of dust and freedom that they alone could navigate. By 1934, Bonnie and Clyde had moved beyond small-town robberies. The road had hardened them, sharpened their instincts, and taught them that survival was the only law that mattered. What had started as petty theft now carried the weight of blood, bullets, and headlines. Every town they entered felt the tension before they arrived. Every sheriff and deputy in their path knew the names, and every stolen car became a weapon of both speed and escape. The gang's mobility was unmatched. Clyde's Ford the 5.8 had become a legend in its own right, stripped for speed, reinforced for defense, and capable of outrunning patrol cars even on poor dirt roads. They traveled mostly at night, slipping through the backroads of Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Missouri. During the day, they hid in barns, abandoned cabins, or isolated farmhouses, blending into the landscape. Every stop was temporary, every mile was a gamble. Violence had become inevitable. The Joplin shootout in 1933 had set the precedent. Now, in 1934, every robbery carried the potential for bloodshed. On a chilly morning in April, the gang hit a grocery store near Commerce, Texas. The clerk, nervous and unarmed, tried to resist. Shots rang out. The store exploded in chaos. When the gang left, 2 men lay on the floor, their lives cut short. Bonnie and Clyde were unhurt, but the weight of another death pressed on them. Violence was no longer accidental, it was a constant, necessary companion. Bonnie herself began to carry a pistol more regularly. Initially, she had kept it for show, a token of solidarity. But after the Commerce robbery, she learned quickly, a gun wasn't just protection, it was survival. She practiced in the fields and at secluded barns, learning to reload and aim. By mid-1934, she could handle a weapon nearly as well as the men around her. In her notebook, she scribbled lines like, "Steal and fire protect those I love, nothing else will." Clyde's tactics had also evolved. He began scouting towns ahead of the gang's arrival, studying law enforcement patterns, and plotting escape routes in advance. Ambushes became part of his method. One such operation occurred in Dexter, Iowa. The gang planned a small store robbery, assuming it would be quick. But a deputy, tipped off by a neighbor, attempted to intercept them. Clyde fired from the car window, the bullets cutting through doors and walls. The gang escaped with only minor injuries, but the encounter added to their infamy. By now, newspapers nationwide labeled them public enemies, romanticized yet feared. The media attention, however, came at a cost. Every story, every photograph, every account made it easier for law enforcement to track them. Photographs captured Bonnie's smile, her gun, her beret. Clyde's confident stare and Browning automatic rifle became symbols. Fans marveled at the couple, but sheriffs studied the images carefully. By mid-1934, the gang's faces were plastered across wanted posters from Texas to Missouri. No county, no small town, could claim ignorance of their presence. Despite the growing danger, the gang's internal dynamics remained tight but tense. Buck Barrow had joined them more regularly, bringing his wife Blanche. Buck often tried to temper Clyde's aggressiveness, reminding him that unnecessary bloodshed invited greater pursuit. W.D. Jones, still a teenager, oscillated between fear and exhilaration, his inexperience a liability that forced Clyde to make quick decisions. Bonnie and Blanche formed a silent bond, their shared presence keeping the group connected amid the constant tension. By the summer of 1934, the gang had expanded its operations. They stole cars not only for escape, but also to carry out increasingly daring robberies across state lines. They hid banks, gas stations, and stores in Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. Each heist required meticulous planning. Clyde calculated distance, road conditions, and timing with military precision. Bonnie documented every stop in her notebook, noting the towns, the dates, and the people they encountered. Her poetry mingled with these entries, creating a strange chronicle of crime and love, blood and devotion. One particularly violent encounter occurred in Platte City, Missouri. The gang had planned a bank robbery, expecting minimal resistance. But local officers had been tipped off. When Clyde fired his Browning automatic rifle from the car window, bullets tore through walls and glass. 2 lawmen were killed. The gang escaped, but the intensity of the firefight marked a turning point. Law enforcement now realized that Bonnie and Clyde were not just thieves but lethal threats. The killings made them public enemies of the highest order. Even with the violence, Bonnie and Clyde maintained their devotion. In quiet moments, they would sit together in the car, sharing cigarettes or exchanging poems. Bonnie's words reflected the mixture of love and fatalism that dominated their lives. "We ride through the dark, the wind our only shield. And in the heart of night, only each other is real." Their love was forged in the crucible of crime, danger, and constant motion, each day a test of loyalty and survival. But the pressure was building. The more deaths and robberies they left behind, the faster law enforcement adapted. State police, sheriffs, and federal agents began coordinating in ways they hadn't before. Roadblocks became frequent, patrols more aggressive, and intelligence networks expanded. Every newspaper photograph, every local tip brought officers closer to the gang. The chase that had once been exhilarating now carried the palpable weight of imminent confrontation. By autumn 1934, the gang's mobility was both a strength and a vulnerability. They had no permanent home, no safe haven. Each robbery was a calculated risk, each mile traveled a decision between freedom and capture. Their legends grew, their names more infamous, and yet the inevitability of law enforcement closing in loomed. A key moment during this period occurred in the tiny town of Grapevine, Texas. The gang attempted a robbery at a gas station, only to find a sheriff waiting with backup. A firefight erupted. Clyde drove at breakneck speed, bullets ripping into the car, while Bonnie returned fire with precision. They escaped, but the incident demonstrated both their skill and the growing dangers. Lawmen were becoming bolder, willing to risk life and limb to stop the couple whose image had become a national obsession. Bonnie's role became increasingly prominent. She was no longer a bystander or romantic symbol. She participated actively, whether helping reload, handling stolen goods, or planning movements. Her poetry continued to provide a voice to their story, her words a counterpoint to the violence that defined their days. Yet, in the quiet, there were signs of fatigue. Each close call left bruises, each firefight left tension. Their love was intense, but so too was the constant pressure. The Barrow gang's notoriety reached its peak during these months. Newspapers carried the images of Bonnie with her pistol, Clyde with his machine gun, and the Ford the Fifth Eight roaring across dusty highways. Public fascination was immense. Some hailed them as modern Robin Hoods, others as dangerous killers. The myth they had unintentionally created now guided public perception more than the facts. Still, despite fame and infamy, they remained fugitives at the mercy of chance. Roads could turn, weapons could jam, and law enforcement could corner them at any moment. Every robbery, every shot fired, and every mile driven further entrenched their legend while bringing them closer to the inevitable. By the end of 1934, Bonnie and Clyde had become symbols of rebellion, danger, and devotion. Their trail of robberies, killings, and narrow escapes was infamous. They had perfected the art of evasion, but they were constantly hunted. The road was both their salvation and their curse. Every mile offered freedom and risk in equal measure, and for Bonnie and Clyde, it was impossible to separate one from the other. By late 1934, Bonnie and Clyde's names had become legend across the Southwest. Their Ford the 5th roared through Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Missouri like a shadow, leaving shattered glass, burned rubber, and headlines in its wake. The Barrow gang had become more than criminals. They were symbols of rebellion in an era of Depression-era despair, feared by lawmen, idolized by some of the public, and hunted across multiple states. The gang, now composed of Bonnie, Clyde, Buck, Blanche, and W.D. Jones, had grown both more skilled and more reckless. Each day brought another calculation: which town to hit, which bank to rob, which roads to travel to avoid patrols. Maps were studied with military precision. Clyde, ever the strategist, memorized every backroad and shortcut he could, ensuring escape from any lawman who might be lying in wait. The group rarely stayed in one place longer than a day. Every hideout was temporary: barns, abandoned cabins, small rented rooms, always chosen with speed and discretion. One evening in November 1934, the gang rolled into Denton County, Texas. A small gas station with an adjacent cafe caught Clyde's eye. They had been on the road for 2 weeks, moving under cover of night, and the crew was restless. Bonnie sat beside him in the car, her notebook in her lap, sketching the layout of the town and jotting lines of poetry. Buck and Blanche watched the streets from the back seat while W.D. Jones clutched a Thompson submachine gun, his knuckles white with tension. Clyde's approach was methodical. He pulled the car into a side street, observing the gas station from the shadows. The clerk behind the counter was young, nervous, and alone. Clyde smiled, nodding to Bonnie, who adjusted the pistol on her hip. In seconds, they entered the station, brandishing weapons. Cash and a small amount of supplies were collected. The robbery was quick, violent in its efficiency, but no one was killed. It was a rare success, fast, clean, and without bloodshed. But that same night, their luck would almost run out. A local deputy, tipped off by a neighbor suspicious of the car parked on the side street, attempted to intercept them. Clyde spotted the patrol as he steered the Ford down a narrow alley. Shots rang out. Bullets struck the car, ricocheting off the metal, while Bonnie and Buck returned fire. The chase wound through back roads and fields, a deadly dance of skill and desperation. By the time the gang disappeared into the night, the deputy was injured but alive, and the incident added another chapter to the growing legend of their audacity. Across the Southwest, newspapers carried the story. Photographs taken from previous hideouts: Bonnie with her beret and pistol, Clyde leaning confidently on the Ford, guns in hand, ran in papers from Dallas to New Orleans. The headlines oscillated between horror and fascination. Gun, maul, and outlaw terrorized Texas countryside. Clyde Barrow, modern Robin Hood or ruthless killer? Public opinion was divided, but the fascination was undeniable. Children collected newspaper clippings, adults whispered tales of their encounters, and lawmen began taking increasingly desperate measures to track them down. Violence became both a necessity and a hallmark of the gang's operations. By early 1935, petty robberies had escalated into deadly confrontations. On one occasion, a bank in Oklahoma City was targeted. The teller resisted, and in the ensuing firefight, a local officer was killed. Clyde's skill with the Browning automatic rifle was evident. Bullets tore through doors and counters, while the gang executed a coordinated retreat. Bonnie, positioned at the car window, covered the escape, firing when necessary. Each encounter taught them lessons about timing, angles, and the ruthlessness required to survive. Despite the danger, Bonnie remained more than a partner in crime. She was the chronicler, the heart of the gang. In hotel rooms, abandoned barns, and quiet roadside cabins, she wrote poetry that captured both the terror and exhilaration of life on the run. Lines like, "We ride through the dark, the wind our only shield, and in the heart of night, only each other is real," reflected the love and intensity that defined her bond with Clyde. Her words gave a voice to the legend, humanizing the couple in ways the newspapers could not. The gang's mobility was unmatched. They stole cars not only for escape but also as weapons, modified for speed and durability. The Ford the 5.8 became an icon, synonymous with their freedom. Clyde's mechanical skill ensured the vehicle could outrun patrols, navigate narrow backroads, and withstand the occasional gunshot. The car was as much a member of the gang as any human, a lifeline, a shield, and a symbol of their defiance. During this period, internal tensions began to rise. Buck and Blanche were increasingly wary of the escalating violence. W.D. Jones, still a teenager, sometimes froze under pressure. Clyde's temper was sharp, and his focus on survival often collided with the rest of the gang's fears. Yet Bonnie's presence stabilized the group. Her calm, her poetry, her unwavering loyalty to Clyde kept the gang cohesive even as the law tightened its grip. One of the most notorious encounters occurred in Platte City, Missouri. The gang attempted another bank robbery, unaware that the police had set up an ambush. The confrontation escalated into a ferocious firefight, bullets striking walls, doors, and cars. Clyde maneuvered the Ford with precision, Bonnie fired from the passenger seat, and Buck returned fire from the back. The gang escaped once more, but the incident cemented their reputation as both dangerous and nearly untouchable. Public fascination with Bonnie and Clyde reached its peak during these months. Photographs captured their audacity, Bonnie smiling with a pistol, Clyde leaning against the car with his Browning rifle. The gang posed casually despite the bloodshed in their wake. Headlines romanticized their exploits. They were labeled lovers, outlaws, modern-day Romeo and Juliet. The myth had surpassed reality, a dangerous, alluring legend that captivated the nation. Yet the law never rested. State police, sheriffs, and federal agents intensified their pursuit. Coordination between departments increased, patrols became more frequent, and every reported sighting was followed immediately. The gang was becoming increasingly aware that their freedom was finite. Each mile traveled, each robbery executed, brought them closer to confrontation. Bonnie and Clyde continued to rely on their bond. In quiet moments on the road, they shared cigarettes, whispered poetry, and brief kisses. Love and survival were intertwined, each feeding the other. Bonnie's writing reflected the tension, danger, and intensity of their lives. "In the dust and the dark, we are alive only for each other, and every mile binds us closer." Her words captured the essence of life on the run, a mixture of fear, passion, and relentless motion. As winter approached in 1935, the gang's operations became more daring. Robberies were executed with military precision. The stolen cars were faster, weapons more lethal, and escape plans increasingly intricate. Yet the inevitability of confrontation loomed. Every newspaper photograph, every stolen car, and every gunfight increased their notoriety, and the law adapted with equal determination. Despite the danger, Bonnie and Clyde embraced the road as their only home. Fields, barns, and abandoned cabins provided shelter. The Ford the 5.8 was their constant companion. Each day was measured not in hours or miles, but in opportunities for survival. Every robbery, every chase, every firefight reinforced their legend and cemented their place in American folklore. The Southwest Rampage of 1934 to 1935 marked a period of transformation. The Barrow gang evolved from small-time thieves into nationally recognized outlaws. Their names were synonymous with danger, defiance, and romance. Every encounter with law enforcement, every newspaper story, every photograph contributed to the legend that would endure long after the bullets had stopped flying. Yet behind the myth, Bonnie and Clyde remained human, vulnerable, exhausted, and aware of the inevitable. Each mile, each heist, and each firefight carried the weight of mortality. The road was both sanctuary and trap, offering freedom while leading them inevitably toward confrontation. By early 1935, the Barrow gang had become a force of nature. Their mobility, skill, and audacity allowed them to elude capture, but the law was closing in. State and federal authorities coordinated more aggressively. Roadblocks became standard, and every sighting brought them closer to the day when luck would run out. The Southwest Rampage had solidified their reputation, heightened their infamy, and expanded their legend. But as Bonnie watched the lights of distant towns flicker past the Ford's windshield, and Clyde's hands gripped the steering wheel with unwavering focus, the truth was unmistakable. Their lives were defined by motion, by danger, and by a bond that refused to break. By 1935, the Barrow gang was both legendary and hunted. Their exploits had captured the imagination of the American public. But for law enforcement, Bonnie and Clyde were no longer just criminals. They were a deadly priority. State police, sheriffs, and federal agents coordinated with a single goal: to end the reign of the outlaws who had terrorized the Southwest for years. The gang's movements had become more calculated, yet every day carried escalating risk. They traveled in modified Ford V8s, vehicles stripped for speed and reinforced for defense, bullets from prior encounters still leaving dents in the metal. Clyde had become a master of escape, reading terrain like a map and calculating police response with uncanny precision. Bonnie remained his constant companion, perched in the passenger seat, notebook in lap, a pistol always within reach. The bond between them had deepened, forged in bullets, blood, and the endless road. Their group had shrunk slightly by this point. Buck Barrow and his wife Blanche remained loyal, yet the constant tension frayed nerves. W.D. Jones, now older and more experienced, was still prone to panic in gunfights, reminding the gang of the fragility of their survival. Despite this, the core of the gang, Bonnie and Clyde, remained unbreakable in spirit. Every escape reinforced their confidence, yet every close call reminded them of mortality. In early 1935, the gang struck a small bank in Iowa. The robbery itself was swift. Clyde fired from the doorway. Bonnie and Buck covered the exits. W.D. Jones collected the cash. But as they fled, a sheriff and his deputies attempted to cut them off. Clyde's driving and knowledge of backroads saved them, but the encounter left a lasting impression. The gang realized that law enforcement was becoming increasingly aggressive, better equipped, and more willing to take risks. The media attention now worked against them. Every photograph of Bonnie with her pistol, Clyde with his Browning rifle, and the Ford V8 speeding through dusty roads helped the public romanticize the couple, yet it also made tracking them easier. Law enforcement distributed wanted posters, shared intelligence across counties, and even collaborated with railroad companies to intercept the gang's movements. Every reported sighting became a clue, every photograph a map for the men pursuing them. By spring, the gang had moved through Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana with relentless precision. Each robbery followed the same pattern: scout, strike, and vanish. Yet the tension in the car was palpable. Clyde's eyes were sharp, scanning every rearview mirror. Bonnie kept her notebook ready, sketching layouts, noting towns, and occasionally writing poetry that captured the fleeting moments of calm between chaos. One encounter in early 1935 in Louisiana demonstrated both their audacity and their increasing recklessness. The gang entered a small grocery store, only to discover a deputy waiting outside. Bullets flew. Clyde maneuvered the Ford through a narrow alley, Bonnie returned fire from the passenger seat, and Buck covered the rear. W.D. Jones, nervous but determined, fired in support. They escaped again, but the incident reinforced a growing pattern. Each successful robbery brought them closer to a confrontation that could not be avoided. The internal dynamics of the gang were strained but held together by loyalty and fear. Buck often questioned Clyde's decisions, warning him about the inevitable consequences of their actions. Blanche expressed anxiety about the constant danger, while W.D. oscillated between excitement and panic. Bonnie, meanwhile, became the emotional anchor. Her calm presence, her poetry, and her unwavering devotion to Clyde kept the group focused and cohesive despite the increasing danger. The Barrow gang's notoriety reached a fever pitch by mid-1935. Newspapers carried images of Bonnie and Clyde in striking poses, Bonnie with her pistol drawn, Clyde leaning against the Ford, guns at the ready. Headlines painted them as both lovers and killers, modern-day Robin Hoods or ruthless criminals, depending on the perspective. Public fascination was immense, but with fame came risk. Every photograph, every article, every reported sighting made it easier for law enforcement to anticipate their moves. By late summer, the gang had become increasingly aggressive. They struck banks, gas stations, and stores across multiple states, often engaging in firefights with police. Clyde's Browning automatic rifle became infamous, its roar echoing through small towns and backroads alike. Bonnie, ever at his side, learned to handle weapons with increasing proficiency, providing cover and protection. The couple had become a deadly duo, their coordination and trust honed by countless close calls. But as 1935 progressed, the relentless pursuit began to take its toll. The gang could no longer travel with the same freedom. Roadblocks, patrols, and informants made every mile a potential trap. Even routine stops for fuel or food carried danger. The freedom of the open road had narrowed into a corridor of tension, every turn a calculated risk. In addition to the increasing police pressure, the gang faced logistical challenges. Vehicles wore down, guns jammed, and wounds from prior encounters slowed movement. Bonnie's limp from earlier injuries was a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Each stop required careful planning: where to hide, how to avoid detection, and how to keep the group together. The stakes had never been higher. Despite the mounting dangers, the gang's romantic bond remained a driving force. Bonnie's poetry reflected both the exhilaration and fatalism of life on the run. Through dust and gunfire, through night and day, we ride together, come what may. The road is ours, but danger is near. Yet in your arms I feel no fear. Her words captured the paradox of their lives, constant peril intertwined with unbreakable loyalty. The relentless pursuit culminated in increasing confrontations with law enforcement. One such encounter in Oklahoma nearly ended the gang's freedom. A patrol had anticipated their route and attempted to intercept them. Bullets tore into the Ford, shattering windows and denting metal. Clyde's driving skill and Bonnie's quick reflexes allowed the gang to escape, but the close call reminded them that the law was closing in, adapting, and learning from every previous encounter. By the fall of 1935, the gang's operations became more desperate. Robberies were executed with greater risk, the group moved faster, and every encounter with law enforcement carried the potential for lethal consequences. The Southwest rampage had transformed Bonnie and Clyde from small-time criminals into notorious outlaws whose names inspired both fear and fascination. Yet with every mile, their freedom was shrinking, and the inevitability of a deadly confrontation loomed larger. Through it all, Bonnie and Clyde remained inseparable. In moments of calm, they would sit together in the car, sharing cigarettes, exchanging whispered words, and scribbling lines of poetry that captured their lives on the run. Love and danger had become inseparable for them. Each robbery, each gunfight, each mile driven reinforced their bond and their dependence on one another. The Barrow gang's legend, by 1935, had reached national prominence. The combination of daring robberies, deadly encounters, and media fascination had created a mythos that transcended their crimes. Yet behind the legend, the human reality remained: exhaustion, fear, and the constant awareness that the law was closing in. Every stop could be their last, every mile a gamble, every moment a dance with death. As the leaves turned in the southwest, Bonnie and Clyde continued their flight. Each robbery, each getaway, and each encounter with the law added to the myth while bringing them closer to the inevitable. The open road, once a symbol of freedom, had become a corridor of tension and peril. For Bonnie and Clyde, survival required skill, speed, and unwavering trust. The final months of 1935 would test that trust and skill to their limits. Law enforcement, now coordinated across state lines and equipped with better intelligence and firepower, was closing in. The couple who had once laughed in the face of danger now felt the pressure of inevitability pressing closer with each passing mile. For Bonnie and Clyde, life remained a mix of romance, risk, and relentless motion. They had become symbols, legends, and cautionary tales all at once. The road carried them forward, a ribbon of dust and danger, where every mile demanded courage, every robbery tested loyalty, and every glance at each other confirmed that only together could. By the spring of 1935, the Barrow gang's freedom was dwindling. Months of robberies, gunfights, and daring escapes had transformed Bonnie and Clyde into household names. Their faces were plastered on wanted posters from Texas to Missouri, and law enforcement had grown increasingly determined to bring them down. Every highway, backroad, and small town in the Southwest now held the potential for discovery, yet the couple and their small gang continued to push forward, trusting only each other and their speed. The gang had become more cautious but still audacious. Their methods evolved with experience, scouting towns ahead of time, memorizing escape routes, and coordinating their movements with military-like precision. Clyde's driving skill remained unmatched, while Bonnie had grown adept at handling a pistol, covering him when danger threatened. Buck Barrow and his wife Blanche provided support, while W.D. Jones, though more competent than a year prior, remained a wild card. In early 1935, law enforcement had escalated their pursuit. Texas Rangers, sheriffs, and federal agents coordinated more closely than ever before. They shared information, pooled resources, and learned from each previous encounter with the gang. Officers studied photographs of Bonnie and Clyde, memorized their features, and mapped potential routes they might use. Every robbery, every car theft, every escape provided lawmen with clues. The gang, however, continued to act with a mixture of boldness and desperation. In March 1935, they struck a small grocery store in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. The robbery went as planned, but as they fled, a deputy attempted to intercept them. Bullets flew. Clyde maneuvered the Ford the 5/8 with expert precision, while Bonnie returned fire from the passenger seat. Buck and W.D. provided cover from the rear. Despite injuries and damage to the car, they escaped once more, leaving behind only the echo of gunfire and the growing legend of their audacity. By mid-1935, law enforcement had developed a strategy that they hoped would finally end the gang's run. They relied on informants, tracked stolen cars, and set ambushes along expected routes. Officers were instructed to anticipate the gang's patterns and prepare for violence. Clyde's boldness and Bonnie's active participation meant that any confrontation could become deadly. But authorities had grown determined. The cost of inaction was too high. The gang's internal dynamics mirrored the tension of their surroundings. Bonnie and Clyde's devotion to one another remained unshaken, but fatigue, fear, and frustration weighed heavily on the others. Buck Barrow's nerves frayed as Clyde's decisions grew riskier, while Blanche worried constantly for her husband and the rest of the gang. W.D. Jones remained loyal, though moments of panic revealed the fragility of even the most experienced members. Bonnie, ever the stabilizing force, attempted to maintain morale. Her poetry and calm presence offered a quiet counterpoint to the violence and chaos around them. In July 1935, the gang's movements brought them to the rural backroads of Louisiana and Texas, areas they had traversed before. They stole cars, hid in barns, and relied on sympathetic locals for food and shelter. Each robbery and getaway further cemented their reputation and expanded their notoriety. Yet with every success, the net tightened. Law enforcement had learned from past encounters. They anticipated the gang's maneuvers, studied their methods, and coordinated roadblocks and ambushes with meticulous care. The final confrontation was months in the making. Police officers, led by Texas Ranger Frank Hamer, meticulously planned a trap. Hamer, a seasoned lawman with experience tracking dangerous criminals, studied Bonnie and Clyde's patterns. He analyzed photographs, mapped routes, and predicted their next moves. Hamer knew the couple's audacity and skill, and he understood that only a carefully executed ambush could bring them down. On a spring morning in May 1935, the ambush was set near Gibbsland, Louisiana, along a remote stretch of highway. Officers hid behind trees and ditches, their weapons loaded and ready. They positioned themselves for maximum effect, anticipating the exact moment when the Ford the 5/8 would come into view. Every detail was precise. Every man knew his role. Hamer and his team understood that Bonnie and Clyde were dangerous, unpredictable, and deadly. Any mistake could be fatal. When the gang appeared in the distance, the officers held their fire until the perfect moment. Clyde, unaware of the trap, drove the car at a steady speed. Bonnie sat beside him, notebook and pistol at the ready. Buck, Blanche, and WD occupied the rear. The car seemed ordinary, just another vehicle traveling along the highway, yet the officers knew the identities of its passengers and the danger they posed. The ambush began in an instant. Bullets tore through the Ford, striking metal, tires, and bodies. The car swerved wildly, yet Clyde had no chance to escape. Bonnie and he were hit multiple times. Buck, Blanche, and WD were also struck, though Buck would survive for a few more days, and WD Jones managed to escape with minor injuries. The ambush was precise, overwhelming, and devastating, a culmination of months of planning and pursuit. When the shooting stopped, the highway was silent except for the echoes of gunfire and the creaking of the disabled car. Bonnie and Clyde lay dead, their bodies riddled with bullets. The Ford, once a symbol of freedom and defiance, was crumpled and battered. The scene was both horrifying and historically significant, the violent end of two of America's most notorious outlaws. News of their deaths spread quickly. Newspapers across the country published photographs of the ambush, the bullet-riddled car, and the bodies of Bonnie and Clyde. Headlines declared the end of the Barrow gang. Bonnie and Clyde killed in Louisiana ambush, end of outlaws who terrorized the Southwest. Public fascination was immediate, mixed with relief, horror, and lingering fascination. The couple who had evaded capture for years were gone, but their legend was immortalized. The ambush did more than end their lives. It marked a turning point in law enforcement tactics. Coordinated efforts across states, the use of informants, and meticulous planning demonstrated a new era of policing. Frank Hamer and his team had achieved what countless others could not, bringing down two of the most notorious criminals of the era in a single, decisive operation. Bonnie's poetry, Clyde's strategic mind, and the gang's audacious crimes were immortalized in the media, film, and literature for decades. Their story became an enduring symbol of the clash between lawlessness and authority, love and violence, freedom and consequence. The ambush, though brutal, ensured that the myth of Bonnie and Clyde would never fade from the public consciousness. Even after death, their legend grew. The photographs of their final moments, the stories of their daring robberies, and the tales of their romantic bond spread across the nation. Bonnie and Clyde became more than criminals. They were symbols of rebellion, passion, and the dangerous allure of living on the edge. The final ambush near Gibbsland was the culmination of years of pursuit, violence, and survival. It represented the inevitability that every life on the run eventually faces. Bonnie and Clyde had evaded capture through skill, luck, and audacity for years, but ultimately, meticulous planning by law enforcement ended their story in a single moment of overwhelming force. For the public, the aftermath was both shocking and fascinating. The outlaws who had captured imaginations across the Southwest were gone, yet the legend remained. Photographs of Bonnie's smile, her pistol in hand, and Clyde's confident stance next to the Ford were circulated alongside the bullet-riddled remains of the car and their bodies. The contrast between life and death, legend and reality, captivated the nation. The ambush not only closed the chapter on Bonnie and Clyde's lives but also set a precedent for law enforcement. The coordination of multiple agencies, the strategic use of informants, and the meticulous planning demonstrated the increasing sophistication of crime prevention and pursuit. It marked the end of an era, one in which outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde could roam relatively unchecked across state lines. Yet despite their violent end, the myth of Bonnie and Clyde endured. The love, audacity, and danger that defined them became immortalized in books, films, and folklore. Their story was told and retold, emphasizing the romance, the rebellion, and the relentless motion of two lives intertwined with crime and destiny. For Bonnie and Clyde, the road had defined them until the very end. Their lives, spent in motion, in pursuit, and in defiance, ended in a single, decisive moment. The ambush near Gibbsland, Louisiana, was not just the end of two lives, it was the final act in a saga that had captivated a nation, a story that would echo through history, blending legend, love, and The story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow did not end with the ambush near Gibbsland, Louisiana, in May 1935. Though their lives were violently cut short, the legend of the young couple who defied the law and lived on the open road endured, and continues to captivate generations. The mythology surrounding Bonnie and Clyde grew rapidly in the years following their deaths, fueled by newspapers, photographs, interviews with law enforcement, and the memories of those who had crossed paths with the Barrow gang. Within hours of the ambush, news crews arrived at the scene. Reporters documented the bullet-riddled Ford the 5-8, the lifeless bodies of Bonnie and Clyde, and the aftermath of the meticulously planned ambush. The photographs that emerged immortalized the couple, capturing Bonnie's beret and confident expression, Clyde's Browning automatic rifle, and the destructive power of their mobility. These images circulated widely, giving the public a vivid glimpse of the outlaws' final moments. Some viewed the photos as evidence of justice served, others saw them as tragic proof of two lives intertwined in love, crime, and defiance. Public fascination intensified in the weeks following the ambush. Newspapers printed detailed accounts of Bonnie and Clyde's exploits, their audacious robberies, their dramatic escapes, and their violent encounters with law enforcement. Editors often romanticized the couple, portraying them as daring lovers living on the edge of society, while glossing over the deaths they had left in their wake. Children cut out photographs, adults recounted their stories at dinner tables, and lawmen relayed tales of close calls and dangerous encounters. Bonnie and Clyde had become a cultural phenomenon. The ambush and its aftermath also had profound effects on law enforcement and criminal pursuit. The collaboration between Texas Rangers, sheriffs, and federal agents showcased a level of planning and coordination that had rarely been applied to fugitives at the time. Frank Hamer, the veteran ranger who led the operation, became a symbol of determination and strategy in policing. His meticulous observation of Bonnie and Clyde's patterns and his willingness to wait for the perfect moment to strike were studied and celebrated in law enforcement circles. The ambush set a precedent for how dangerous criminals could be confronted and captured, or, in this case, eliminated. Yet the Barrow gang's story was more than a tale of crime and violence. It was a story of myth-making. Bonnie's poetry, written during the gang's years on the run, added depth to her public image. Lines such as, "We ride where no one follows, we love where no one stays. The wind is ours, the night is ours, until the world finds its way," offered a glimpse into the internal lives of the young couple. Her words painted them as romantics at the center of chaos, giving the legend a human and artistic dimension. Scholars and fans would later study her poetry, seeking insight into the mind of a woman who lived and loved amid danger. Clyde's legacy was equally complex. His skill with vehicles, firearms, and tactics made him one of the most feared and respected outlaws of the 1930s. The Ford the 5-8 became more than just a getaway car. It became a symbol of defiance, speed, and ingenuity. Stories of Clyde's precision in ambushes, his ability to evade pursuit, and his mastery of escape routes were shared among lawmen and criminals alike. He became a figure of admiration for some, terror for others, and an enduring icon of criminal audacity. The deaths of Bonnie and Clyde also reverberated through their families, friends, and associates. Buck Barrow, seriously injured during the ambush, died days later, while Blanche Barrow faced imprisonment and public scrutiny. W.D. Jones, having escaped the ambush, lived to recount stories of their final days, adding personal perspective to the public narrative. For those closest to the gang, the legend was intertwined with grief, guilt, and survival, highlighting the human cost behind the myth. In the decades following their deaths, Bonnie and Clyde became embedded in popular culture. Hollywood films, books, songs, and television shows romanticized their story, often emphasizing love and rebellion over the violence that defined their real lives. The 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde cemented their status as icons of American culture, introducing the legend to a new generation. Yet beneath the glamour, historians and biographers emphasized the harsh realities of their lives. The constant fear, the relentless pursuit, and the trail of death and destruction left behind. The legend was further fueled by objects and memorabilia recovered after the ambush. photographs, Bonnie's notebooks, guns, and the bullet-riddled Ford the 5th were preserved and displayed, becoming symbols of a time when the line between heroism and criminality was blurred in the public imagination. Museums, historical societies, and private collectors ensured that the tangible evidence of their lives continued to captivate audiences decades later. In the towns where the Barrow gang had passed through, local memories persisted. Older residents recounted sightings, encounters, and near misses, preserving oral histories of Bonnie and Clyde's rampage across the Southwest. These stories often emphasized their charisma, daring, and the thrill of their escapes, blending fact and legend in ways that made the couple larger than life. In some areas, the memory of the gang became part of local folklore, with stories passed down from generation to generation. Academic studies and biographies examined the cultural significance of Bonnie and Clyde. Scholars analyzed their impact on American perceptions of crime, law enforcement, and romance. They explored how the couple's story reflected the economic despair of the Depression, the allure of rebellion, and the media's role in myth-making. The enduring fascination with Bonnie and Clyde was not merely about crime. It was about the intersection of love, danger, and defiance in an era defined by hardship. Their legacy also influenced law enforcement practices. The ambush in Louisiana demonstrated the effectiveness of intelligence, planning, and coordination across jurisdictions. Modern policing strategies, particularly in cases involving dangerous fugitives, drew lessons from the operation. Frank Hamer's approach, patience, preparation, and the anticipation of the outlaws' movements became a model for lawmen in subsequent decades. Bonnie and Clyde's story, however, was never static. It evolved with time, taking on new meanings for different audiences. For some, they were tragic romantics who dared to challenge the world. For others, they were dangerous criminals whose violent actions caused irreparable harm. Their stories served as a cautionary tale, a romance, and a legend, all at once. The duality of their legacy ensured that they remained relevant long after their deaths, a topic of fascination for historians, filmmakers, and the public alike. Even their style contributed to their legend. Bonnie's beret, lipstick, and confident demeanor became iconic, often emulated in photographs, fashion, and media representations. Clyde's lean, rugged appearance, combined with the machine gun and the Ford the 5th, reinforced the archetype of the American outlaw. Their image, captured in newspapers and photographs, transcended the events of their lives, creating enduring icons that represented both rebellion and romance. The American fascination with Bonnie and Clyde was amplified by the context of the 1930s. The Great Depression created a society captivated by tales of defiance against authority. Outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde, who operated outside the law while displaying loyalty, love, and audacity, resonated with a public eager for escapism. Their story was a blend of fear, admiration, and the dark allure of freedom unbound by societal norms. Decades after their deaths, their story continued to inspire new works of art, literature, and scholarship. Historians examined their crimes, law enforcement's response, and the social conditions that allowed them to flourish. Filmmakers dramatized their exploits, emphasizing both romance and action. Poets, musicians, and artists drew inspiration from Bonnie's writings and the couple's audacious life on the road. The myth of Bonnie and Clyde became embedded in American culture, a story constantly retold and reinterpreted. In the final analysis, the legend of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow was defined by contradiction. They were lovers and killers, criminals and folk heroes, fugitives and symbols. Their lives were brief, violent, and intense, yet their story endured long after the bullets ended their flight. The ambush that concluded their lives also marked the beginning of a narrative that would captivate the world for generations. Bonnie and Clyde's legacy is ultimately a testament to the power of myth. Their story combined love, danger, rebellion, and survival in a way that resonated far beyond the towns they passed through, the highways they traveled, and the headlines they inspired. From their first robbery to their violent deaths, they lived on their own terms, constantly moving, evading capture, and defying the conventions of their era. Their tale reminds us that legends are built not only on deeds but on perception, storytelling, and cultural memory.